forums discussion this week. This is going to be interesting discussion this evening. It's going to be on the Islamic idea of nature. And as you all know, it's not about nature or environment. It's about the idea or how did nature come into existence? How do Muslims visualize the creation of nature? And how was it caused, the causality of nature? It's basically, we are going to deal with the theology of science in Islam, the Sunni theology, basically. We're not going to discuss the Shia theology. From a Sunni perspective, how do Sunnis view the creation of nature or the existence of nature? Or is causation, how did it come into existence and being created? So there are a lot of theories, and today we have here a good friend of mine, Professor Gokhan Bacik from Czechoslovakia. I think it's no more Czechoslovakia. It's the Czech Republic now, right?
It's only Czech.
Slovakia has separated from the Czech Republic. So there's no more Slovakia there. So he's just to give you a brief introduction of Professor Gokhan Bacik. He's a professor of political science at the Palacky University, Czech Republic. He has also taught in different universities as visiting professor. He's the author of September 11 and World Politics, Hybrid Sovereignty in the Middle East, in the Arab Middle East, Islam and Muslim Resistance to Modernity in Turkey. I think that's the book from which he's been discussing the idea of Islamic idea of nature. That book was published last year, and I was going through it today, and it's quite an interesting book, especially the chapter on the idea of nature. Quite interesting. It speaks about Ghazali, Ibn Rushd, and how others have understood Islam, and basically it's about Asharism. How Asharis forced their way into into the Muslim societies or the Muslim minds. Basically, today what prevails basically is the Ashari view, not the Mu'tazili view, actually, in a sense. So, and Professor Gokhan is also has published in leading journals such as the Middle East Policy, Middle Eastern Studies, International Review of Sociology, Electoral Studies, the Muslim World, Arab Studies Quarterly, Studies in Conflict and Terrorism, Nationalism and Ethnic Studies, Terrorism and Political Violence, Foreign Affairs, Lima, Peace Review. These are some of the major publications in which he has been published, and he has written in these publications. And he's quite a well-known figure in Europe and all over the world, in fact. He was basically introduced to me, my other friend, Ahmad Guru, who spoke to us a few weeks ago. And I'm really glad that he introduced me to Professor Gokhan, and he was kind enough to accept my invitation to speak on his book today. In fact, he's coming up with another book which is going to be published soon by I.B. Torres. It's titled Contemporary Rationalist Islam, the Religious Critique of Sunni Revival. So this is basically the new book which will be published by I.B. Torres shortly. I think we look forward to that, and perhaps I'm sure we're going to have another discussion on it. I'm sure, Gokhan, you will come to us again for another discussion on your new book, inshallah.
Inshallah.
So basically what you're trying to understand here is, how did life come into existence? How did the universe come into existence, and what caused it? Or is it about God causing it, or did God only initiate it and things came into being on their own? So how do we understand it from an Islamic theology? These are some interesting questions that Muslims have been trying to grapple with for a long time. And Gokhan has written an entire book on that, basically, and he's here to discuss that. So the format is this way. He will be talking for about 30 to 40 minutes on the subject. And then I and Gokhan will have a brief conversation on the book itself for about 15-20 minutes. And then for the next 60 minutes, it will be open to questions and answers to the people who are here, the audience. Therefore, I think we look forward to a very interesting evening of discussion. Thanks a lot, participants, for being here, and thank you, Gokhan, for coming here. Over to you.
Okay, hello everybody. Faiz, thanks a lot for inviting me. It's a very interesting experience for me. It's always interesting to talk about some ideas with colleagues, and particularly like this one, some people around or across the globe. Let me first very briefly explain the reason behind why I did write this book. Mainly, I was raised in a religious environment in Turkey.
Okay.
So observing some developments in the Middle East as a political scientist in the last 10 years, mainly since the beginning of Arab uprising, I decided to write a series of books on religion. I'm a political scientist, so I'm interested in religious issues from modern social sciences. So I decided to write, this is my first book where I focus on the idea of nature, which I explain later. Because while reviewing the literature on Islam, I noticed that the whole literature is about some substantial questions, some major questions. There are a lot of books, but when you look carefully, you observe that they all speculate on the same, let's say, centennial questions. Among them, one is nature. And of course, my book or the speech about the idea of nature is, you can see this discussion within the same, let's say, genre of how Muslims interpret Islam and how they practice and its various consequences to explain state of Muslim politics. So let me first explain my puzzle, okay? And I hope you all see my screen. Is it okay?
Yes, yes, we can see that.
So
yes.
wait. Okay. So very briefly, I'm sure you are familiar with the let's say grand literature. There are a lot of books about Islam, and the main point about these books are about how Islam is interpreted and practiced. And according to this literature, how Muslims interpret and practice Islam creates some problems. This is not to see Islam as the main problem or only the only source of the problems. I'm not saying that, but colleagues or scholars in this literature accept or recognize that how Muslims interpret or practice Islam is one of the main reasons to explain some social and economic problems. So basically, so this is about the quality of interpretation. The quality here means both in terms of good and bad. Is it updated? Is it scientific? For example, if we are talking about the problem of women, is it updated according to contemporary standards, so and so forth? So it's very subjective. So I'm not in a position to suggest this is better than the other, but I should remind you, inform you that my book or my discussion today is another example of this great literature, this grand debate in contemporary Islamic thought. So I'm interested is how Islam is interpreted and practiced and how it is relevant. And of course, when we start talking about how Islam is interpreted, it's not an easy concept because there are many ways. Let me remind you, probably you are aware of that. For example, Faiz talking about Ahmed Kuru. It's in his book, he analyzed this interpretation from State Ulema Alliance. But there are some other scholars as well. For example, Timur Kuran, like many other colleagues, focus on law. So according to that perspective, the question of how Muslims interpret Islam and practice is mainly a problem about the law. So as you can imagine, the arguments is the law is problematic. It's not updated as you see in Quran. For example, he has many books and articles on that. He basically argues that the Islamic law doesn't, let's say, allow the emergence of accumulation of wealth among Muslim society. It's a problem in terms of explaining why there is no free market economies in societies, so on and so forth. But we have another guys such as Fatsini or Fatma Mernisi, for example. They are all focusing on the same question. The subject matter, the problem here is the interpretation of Islam. But as you see in this short list, we can, of course, add many other people in the list. The main question is, many people are analyzing the same question. The question is how Islam is interpreted and practiced by Muslims and its various consequences in the field of economy, law, or women, so on and so forth. So while reviewing literature, I noticed that many of the studies focus on these questions. I mean, mainly legal theories or the law, for example, or democratization theory, the gender question. But there is another way, because the interplay between Islam and Muslims, as you can imagine, is very sophisticated. There are a lot of aspects. For example, you can focus on the economic aspect, history, the idea of history, so on and so forth. And I focus on a rarely analyzed subject, which is idea of nature. So I am here to explain how Muslims interpret Islam in reference to idea of nature and its consequences. But before, let me explain what I mean by the idea of nature, because as Faiz has mentioned, when I say nature, people usually think about evolution or some kind of environment, which is not the fact. I use the idea of nature as an umbrella term. So later I will explain, but briefly, the idea of Islamic nature is the collection of beliefs concerning how nature works that Muslims acquire during religious socialization. So it's a kind of typical story of average Muslim. Imagine in Turkey, you are socialized in family environment, you're going to informal religious school in a mosque neighborhood. In the mosque, you start learning about theology, you start learning about Islam, Islamic history, and within that socialization, you also get some kind of ideas about God, about nature, for example, about causality. Why things happening in this way? And how am I supposed to position myself within this context? So this is the general idea of definition of idea of nature. But if it's an umbrella term, as I said, later I will explain in detail. But basically, let me repeat this frame. It is the collection of opinions, religious opinions on nature. So it could be about anything, about evolution, about causality, about why we have earthquakes, for example. And the second question, if there is any religious idea of nature, is it same, for example, we compare it with modern idea of nature? Or is it same, are there some differences between Western idea of nature or let's say Islamic idea of nature? Before going into detail, why this is a problem, or is it a problem? To answer this question, I want to focus on another connected topic, which is Islam's resilience. Studying Islam in terms of idea of nature is quite difficult problem, or also necessity, because Islam, compared with Christianity, is a still, let's say, resilient. What I mean by resilience, if you comparatively analyze Islam and Christianity, you see that unlike Christianity, Islamic societies, very much like medieval ages, before modernity, still see Islam as having its traditional powers. So the problem about studying the idea of nature as a major difference with the Western societies, here in the Muslim world, we have religion which still speaks about nature, which still speaks of causality. So it's not like typical Western society. It's not like post-secularization or post-reform Western society. So I frame it as Islam resilience. So like many other Muslim societies, my case, which I studied through 5 other small cases, the Turkish society, still recognize Islam as a ground theory, if I may say, or paradigm, which also has some ideas about nature. So being religious, going back to religious socialization, if you become religious in Turkish socialization context, you have now some sort of ideas you learn from school, let's say modern idea of nature, but along with that, you have this Islamic views about nature, because Islam is still not yielding to modernity, even in Turkish society, unlike Western societies. Let me go in detail. Okay, this is the basic theory. If you read the literature, such as Mark Bloch or another medieval historian, or if you read 11th century Muslim societies by some typical historians such as Lapidus or Taberi, you see that in medieval ages, religion was the center of social life. But we have this modernization theory, and at the end, there was a clash between modernity and religion, and this is the table. And after this process, legislation was now possessed by modern state. So, but here at this level, there is a resistance. So according to modernization theory, religion is no longer source of legislation. Let me give you an example. For example, I am living in Czech Republic, which is a member of European Union. We call acquis communautaire the whole legislation of European Union, thousands and thousands of pages about environment, about free trade. There is no single reference to religion. So European Union is a typical example where Christianity completely yielded to modernity. The second is modern science, which is I am very much interested, because if you remember, if you read the literature about Timur Kuran, Ahmet Kuru, they are more about the state-society relations, because they look more on legislation, which is great. But when you talk about idea of nature, then we have the second clash. So the question is, has Islam yielded to modern science? Because modernity requires religion yield completely to modern science. And very speaking in a simplistic way, science then says, okay, it's my job. I'm going to explain about causality. I'm going to talk about nature. I'm going to talk about free will. So religion is in a position to give up explaining nature. And part of that, so you can imagine modern state and modern science as twins of modernity. So twins of modernity. So basically the whole literature about how Muslims interpret and practice Islam are focusing either modern state aspect or modern science aspect. So I'm going on the second trajectory. And I want to emphasize modern medicine, which is part of modern science. Let me give you some interesting examples to emphasize what I mean. For example, according to modernity, it is the doctor who has the authority to decide who is ill and who is healthy. For example, as a professor, only a doctor's report can exempt my student from my exam. There is no other authority. Again, according to modern medicine, to emphasize how it's critical, for example, normally you are either sleeping or awake. If you come up with the idea of I'm speaking with angels or I get some inspiration from metaphysics, then you are ill. So modernity is not only about legislation, but very much about how you understand nature. If your nature has some people getting some inner knowledge, for example, as we know from later I will quote Ghazali, for example, then it doesn't seem something good, okay? It's beyond modernity, so you are probably advised to see a doctor. So this is the main area where Islam is resilient. So Islam is not yielding completely, unlike Christianity, modern state, nor to modern science. So based on this discussion, as you see in this paragraph, according to modernity demands religion, it narrows its all-encompassing reach, leaving all ciphers beyond its own episteme. And there is a demarcated set of beliefs, and where religion cannot intervene. So you can compare, if you put in a historical perspective, it's just like opposite of medieval ages. So religion is no longer all-encompassing. It may talk about morality, but it cannot source of legislation. It can talk about, for example, some normative values, but it cannot teach on nature. Because now, like modern state in this legislation, we have modern science in terms of religion's relations with modern society. Now, to give some examples, what I mean by Islam resilience, for example, in terms of law, there are many studies, but this is a very interesting case that gives the basic of what I'm trying to explain in one example. For example, there is one book edited by Otto. If you read this book, you see that there are many states where Islam is either a source of law or the source of law. For example, Jordan, for example, let's say Egypt, for example, some civic, let's say, codes even in India, for example. So this means that unlike West, unlike the modern example, there is a resilience among Muslim societies. And this resilience is mostly visible at political level. And even if you analyze some PEW surveys, you see that many Muslims still want Islamic law to be the official law, which means that unlike Christianity and Western societies, Islam retains being authority or source of authority in law as well as in nature. So this is so let me summarize this part, because this is the theory I just test in the Turkish case. So unlike Christianity, Islam is a resilient religion which still among Muslims source of authority in law, in politics, and even in terms of nature, as I will go in detail later. So, and this brings us to what is meant by modernity. I think this is another important topic which is confused. For example, writing this book, I read a lot of books and literature, articles. For example, as you see here in 1998, a leading Muslim scholar on Muslim societies claimed that there is a Muslim reformation. I remember the discussion before Arab uprising. In late 90s, we were talking about Islam's modernity. We were challenging Fukuyama, we were challenging Huntington. But then we have this kind of radicalization trend, including in Turkey. Islamic actors in Malaysia, in Turkey, transform many societies into authoritarian. So it requires, we should revisit our understanding of modernity. What is meant by Muslims are becoming modern? I don't mean that Muslims should become modern. I'm just trying to understand what is meant by modernity, or what we should understand properly by modernity. When I read the literature, I noticed that Muslims understand modernity mainly through institutional, at institutional level, which is critical from my book, because in my understanding, as I say in the beginning, I separate Islam at political level and at scientific level. Because if you go through a political level, you many times analyze Islam as institutional. For example, here's a very interesting case. An Islamic movement having a radio station. Is it a sign of modernization? Or talk about Iran, for example. Iran is a modern. There are many books, and as a political scientist, I will rate Iran as a modern state. But is it all? Then this brings us to a table, and this table, as you see on, so I approach modernization beyond institutions. So on the left, on the right side, you have urbanization, citizenship, modern state, modern international system. While writing my book, I observed that Muslims are extremely successful in adapting modernity in terms of its practice. For example, the Iranian constitution is a typical example. If you read Iranian constitution, there's a special article which regulates Grand Ayatollah, Iranian spiritual leader. And the article says that the Grand Ayatollah is the leader of not only Shia people in Iran, but all Muslims, even humanity. But imagine I'm going to Iran and I want to run for local elections in Iran, which is not possible because Iranian constitution is based on citizenship. So even, for example, or imagine as a Muslim, I want to go to Saudi Arabia, but I am asked for a visa, which means that Muslims experience with modernity at institutional level, which I mean by institutional level, urbanization, citizenship, modern state, modern internet, are very successful. But when it comes to modernity as a paradigm, then it's about rationality, separation of fields, secularism, gender relations, science, and rational boundaries. We have a lot of problems. Or, I mean, the word problem is very qualitative. There are some issues about that. So when I study Islam, interpretation of Islam in terms of idea of nature, I focus on modernity as paradigm. So there are, so the interesting case about Turkey is a very brilliant case to observe how Muslims are successful in modernization, but at institutional level, but still as at paradigmatic level, we observe the same resistance to modernity in terms of science, secularism, gender relations, rationality. I will go on the detail later. So this is the main table, the theoretical table. So when I say modernization, of course, institutional level modernization is important, but if I'm talking about the idea of nature, I must focus on the left paradigm, on the left side of this table, which is modernity as paradigm. Okay, now let me explain what I mean by the idea of nature. A few minutes before I said that it's an umbrella term. So I analyzed the idea of nature under 4 major questions. One, it's about how nature works. The second is, it's about God and nature. Is God an agent in nature or not? The second question is God personal or not personal? Which means when we talk about God, is there a personality or it's a cosmic God? Is God an agent or not? Which is about free will, because if we are talking about nature, causality, free will, I should talk about how it affects my freedom. Am I free? Or I can do only things that God, tolerates. It's a philosophical question. Are human beings ontologically free? And the 4th level is knowledge. In physics, for example, Aristotle says that, or in modern science, knowledge is the thing we get when we analyze the causality among things. Is there other types of knowledge? For example, inner knowledge, kashf, for example. Shall we believe as Muslims there are some scholars across the globe, they get some sort of knowledge such as Abdul Qadir Geylani, Sirhindi, because this is very much part of nature. Because if you believe that there is a scientific knowledge which based on causality of the things, among the things, but there's another knowledge, some people, then everything changes. I don't want to go in very much detail, but while writing this book, I analyzed many, many books. One example, there is a famous book in Turkey, which the religious authority, Diyanet, constitutional religious authority, Diyanet, distributes to households, İlmihal, the main catechist books. This is the book you can find every school, library, household. While it is listing the basic of Islamic faith, it says the inner knowledge of Evliya, ulema, or scholars are just right. So in Turkey, if you are becoming a Muslim part of socialization, the basic catechist book you are given by state-controlled Diyanet, Authority of Religious Affairs, which controls all religious system in Turkey, basically underlines that you should believe in inner knowledge, which means that in your nature, there is a knowledge based on causality, the scientific knowledge, you know, empiricism, so on and so forth, but there is another knowledge. So there are some people who write books in Turkey across the globe that they believe that they are inspired by God. So basically, going back to discussion, I define the idea of nature at 4 levels. Now, I want to emphasize that, as you can imagine, you can give different answers to this question. For example, you can believe in a personal God or non-personal. But please don't forget, how you answer one of these questions shape the other. For example, if you believe in personal God, then your God is agent in this universe. If God is agent in this universe, you are more akin to believe in inner knowledge. In the same way, when I review all the literature, maybe I will talk about later during discussions. For example, if you read Mu'tazile or Ibn Rushd or Al-Farabi or even Ibn Khaldun, you have this idea of emphasis on causality, then God becomes less personal. So it's a kind of mechanism, the idea of nature. So if your God is personal God, he's an agent. If he's an agent, there must be some saints who are in connecting with that. So you should think them as provoking each other. So you rarely see some sort of religious paradigm among Muslims in the Turkish case who believes personal God but doesn't believe in inner knowledge. Very rarely. So when you are looking at this table, please keep in your mind that these are connected. So, for example, in typical Ash'ari, God is personal. If you read Ghazali, you feel that Ghazali is alarmed by cosmic idea. This is so he seems to never accept that, okay, God cannot be in a kind of, let's say, Claudia or kind of energy. So this is called personal God. In Islamic terminology, it's called tashbih. Okay, so this is the idea of nature. Now, I'm not sure if I should review the literature. There is a huge literature about that. Even I should say that maybe 50% of whole classical debates on Islam is about these questions, because this is the main discussions, what we mean by Islamic theology. So you have Bakillani, you have Ibn Rushd, you have Kitab al-Ibana Ash'ari, you have Maturidi and its interpretations in the following centuries. And there are 2 chapters about this in my book. So I don't want to go in detail, but when I read the whole literature, I come up with the conclusion, this is the Sunni paradigm. Okay, so the Sunni paradigm is, there is a personal God, and God is agent, which means, agent means that everything is doing, is done by God directly. He's also the agent of the things in the nature. Okay, this is what is meant by agent, is as an actor, part of universe. And the third point is there is an inner knowledge. As I give examples, I can give many other examples. I mean, even if you read any book, any contemporary book, there is an open gate for inner knowledge in contemporary Islam. This is the impact of Sufism, you know, after particularly 11th century, but even before 11th century, there were Sufi guys such as Sulaimi, but now it is part of Sunni Islam. So you can't imagine Sunni Islam where the knowledge is the only material knowledge. And As a consequence, there's a reluctant view of free will, okay? So the Sunni paradigm is very, very sensitive on free will, okay? There are many discussions, but at all, there is no Western type of free will in that. And this is the table, okay? So this is also a very general table. If you put these two poles, on the left side, we have the Sunni Islam, Al-Ash'ari, Razi, Ghazali. Actually, Ghazali is the interpreter of Ash'ari, Razi is the interpreter of Ghazali. Maybe Razi is a bit open to, let's say, rational elements, but this is the main Sunni paradigm who create these discussions, and particularly Ash'ari's Kitab al-Lum'a and Kitab al-Ibana are the main books that created this thinking, where causality is repudiated, which is called occasionalism, okay? So what we see as causality is an illusion every time it is done by God, but that regularity is perceived by us as a kind of causality, which is not in fact very much detailed. So on the right side, we have some people in different scales. For example, Farabi is extremely, in that sense, rationalist. Mu'tazila, in Mu'tazila, man is the creator of, and we have Ibn Rushd, who is a different perspective. Later I will talk about Maturidi, but this is the main scale, main table. If you read any book, any article about the idea of nature, free will, causality, on Islam, you come up with this table. You can put some other names in this table, add into this table, but this is the main logic. Now, here's the question. Here's the point. These two perspectives are competing. This is a grand debate, but the debate was won by Al-Ash'ari, Razi, and Ghazali. So why? Reading the literature and some historical discussions, I come up with the two solutions. One is the Sunni paradigm is very populist. It's very easy. You can market it to people, compare it with philosophers. I mean, Farabi is very complicated. Mu'tazili is very complicated. But the idea of God as an agent, answering your praise, is your life, giving you kid, everything done by God. This is very easy to, to become popular among people. The second reason is Sunni revival thesis. Probably you know this from many books, including Ahmed Kuru's book. It is mainly the state-society alliance after 11th century, madrasas, mainly after Seljuki Empire. The Sunni theory became state-sponsored official paradigm. So why Sunnism in this way prevails among Muslims? If it is because of its popularity, it's very simple. It is very, easy to consume by average people, but also it is the state-sponsored. For example, Jonathan Brown has a book, The Canonization of Buhari. You see that Buhari, when he wrote his book, in the beginning he was criticized, but later it became part of curriculum, mainly in Seljuki madrasas. So why this grand paradigm, theological paradigm, you name it, Ash'ari paradigm, is dominant? It's mainly because of state-society alliance. Why? The question is very simple. Because it's very friendly paradigm for state perspectives. From political concerns, I think the Sunni theological paradigm is something that states might be happy of that, okay? I can go in detail later, but as I said, it's just like the rise of Sunni revival thesis, which we know since 1940s, since some other early Orientalists, which they explained the rise of Ash'ari paradigm, Shafi paradigm, mainly as a result of the cooperation between Sunni madrasas and the state. So two reasons. Now, so this is the grand debate. Let me some examples. I don't want to go in literature, probably you are aware of. For example, in Kitab al-Lu'a, Al-Ash'ari says that all things proceed from others are acts of God. So there is no independent, autonomous natural law that binds them. Ghazali is famous, God creates them independent, and the famous example, the burning of cotton, Ghazali says that it's not nature, but God burns the cotton. Or in Munqidh, for example, he says that if we recognize natural law, it's a contempt of God. I can give many other examples in regard to personal God or inner knowledge. Again, in Munqidh, which is the autobiography of Ghazali, Ghazali introduced inner knowledge as a legitimate way of knowing the things, or as an alternative mode of knowledge, and he says that the mystics have an ability to acquire that knowledge. So these are the examples. Okay, now going back to this table, there are many discussions we can do, but I will only quote one example how they are opposite to each other. This quotation is from famous Tahafut by Ibn Rushd, Averroes, the Spanish guy. By the way, Ibn Rushd was a philosopher, but also he is the chief qadi. He has an author of Bidayat Mujtahid, published today even 2 volumes. He's a very, very interesting guy also in religious sciences. So how Ibn Rushd understand the Ash'ari idea of nature while he is criticizing Ghazali in Tahafut al-Tahafut is very illuminative. Let's read it. Let me read it, okay? As you see here, analyzing Ash'ari idea of nature, Ibn Rushd says that what you say is a tyrannical prince, it's a tyrant. Because in that perspective, no standard. There is no standard. So this is, I think, very important. So this shows the tension between 2 different paradigms. The Sunni paradigm, where is God? There are no rules. God can suspend the universe, supernatural. A man can fly, according to Ash'ari, because there is no natural. What we see as natural is the regularity. But from an opposite perspective, Ibn Rushd clearly says that what you are talking is simply a tyrant, because it's a tyrannical prince who has the highest power. Nobody in his dominion can deputize. Can deputize means man has no agency. So we are not agent, we are not capable, of whom no standard. So this is the major point. So when we talk about the idea of nature in Islamic societies, we're exactly talking about this tension, the Ash'ari perspective and the it's very difficult to generalize the opposite, but there are guys such as Ibn Khaldun who tries to reconcile Ibn Rushd and Ghazali. Even Ibn Tufayl, if you read Ibn Tufayl high, you see that maybe I should say that if you go to 15th century, there is the Muslim East, Cairo-centered, Muslim West, Spain and North Africa. Spain and North Africa is a bit different because Ibn Tufayl, Ibn Rushd, and also Ibn Khaldun, they are trying to create a kind of moderate synthesis of Ghazali and Aristotle. So they are more open to causality. And in Rushd's case, that's a very strong criticism of Ash'ari. It's a tyrannical prince. I think it is correct. I will show you later. If you read the Turkish literature on God, it's very much like Ibn Rushd's criticism of Ash'ari. So there is a God who decides everything, who is the agent. So it's the absolute authority, and there is no rule that binds God. And I don't want to quote in detail. This discussion is very interesting. For example, in both Ash'ari and Ghazali, there are questions such like that. Can God torture a kid, for example? The answer is yes, because God is above any law, including moral law. So let me summarize that. In Ash'ari, whatever God does is the law. So God can torture a kid. And they discuss in this clarity. They give the same examples, for example. Actually, the torturing kid example belongs to Ash'ari, which is copied by later Al-Ghazali. Okay, so now let me focus in the remaining quick part, the Turkish case. First of all, the Turkish case, interestingly, Maturidi. So I am trying to analyze the idea of nature in Turkey. Why I focus, please pay attention, Turkey is a secular country. So unlike Egypt or, I don't know, Pakistan or Iran, Islamic law is not officially recognized. So how Islam influenced Muslim cannot be analyzed through Islamic law, Sharia. Still, it's a secular society. Even it's been almost 20 years, AKP has not amended any law and introduced any Islamic law. So mostly that gap, which doesn't exist law, in Turkish case fulfilled by as idea of nature. And if you read the Turkish actors' books, literature, you see that it's mainly idea of nature that substitutes Sharia. There are a lot of references. Very briefly, I will give you an example. Traditionally, when you read the literature in general and on Turkey, you come up Maturidi. Let me summarize my ideas about that. First of all, I don't think there exists a Maturidi view. Of course, Maturidi is important. He has a book, Kitabul Tawhid, but it's just an intellectual construction. I don't think there is a strong, vibrant paradigm as an alternative to Ash'ari. So it's merely intellectual tradition. And the best book, probably in English, Rudolf Peters, as he said, it is the famous unknown, unknown famous. So Turks are Maturidi is an illusion. If you go to Ottoman experience, no, it's not the case. I have a chapter in my book. I review all relevant first-hand resources and come up with the idea that even Ottomans were following the Ash'ari. The second point is, if you look at the Ottoman example, there is the belief among Ottomans that Maturidi and Ash'ari are same, which is not correct, And this, the Philip Dorul thesis I quote here, when you read the Ottoman era theologians, you notice that even they are not engaged with the Maturidi directly. I will give you two interesting examples about that. Maturidi's Kitabul Tevhid was translated in Turkish in 2000. It's very late. When I finished writing this book, it was March 2018, there was no biography by Maturidi in Turkish, but there was biographies of Ash'ari. So even on paper, yes, Turks are Maturidi. If you speak with a Turk, you ask, probably he or she would say that I am Maturidi, but when you go in detail, you come up the idea that no, in practice, Ottoman madrasa system and even theological books, as a final example, for example, last example, I recently read an exegesis by Turkish official Diyanet, Authority of Religious Affairs, I don't know how to name. It's 5 volumes, the most contemporary exegesis of Quran tafsir. It's mainly written according to Ghazali and Razi. So even in the Turkish case, if you read the literature, you notice that Turks are Maturidi is just a kind of, let's say, hypothetical scenario. But later I will test it in 5 cases. Okay, so to test this theory in the Turkish case, I focus 5 cases. Let me explain them very quickly because I'm out of time. First is Diyanet. Diyanet is the official constitutional body which is paid by Turkish central budget. There are 120,000 people working for Diyanet. In every mosque, the imam is appointed by Diyanet. So I analyze Diyanet's books. The second is compulsory religious courses. In Turkey, all schools should teach its students 8 years compulsory religious courses. I analyze these books and I focus on 3 Islamic movements. These are selected by purpose. Iskender Pasha order is important because Turkish political Islam emerged from this order. Erdogan, for example. Necmettin Erbakan, for example. The historical origin of Turkish political Islam is Iskender Pasha. So I check what is the idea of nature they advise to society. Işıkçılar is interesting because they are important in media. So they have some instruments to bring their message to society. Erenköy movement is also critical because it is the movement that is close connections with Diyanet. If you go, for example, the Mufti of Istanbul, which is appointed by Diyanet, is member of Erenköy movement. And Erenköy Işıkçılar are the most favored Islamic movements in Turkey right now by the government. So I analyze their books, discussions, recorded speeches. It's a huge literature, and I come up with the conclusion. So I can give you many examples, but let me focus on Ministry of Education. I analyzed the textbook distributed to students. Now let me show you some quotations from, for example, this is a textbook. Look at the question, why do people construct stronger houses in quake regions? Which physical laws should be considered? This is a quotation from religious course, which means that Islam, as taught in Turkey, unlike Christianity, is still not yielding to modern science. So when you read a sermon by a Nakshi, or a member of scholar from Işıkçılar community, or a textbook taught in school, you see a lot of reference to idea of nature. I think this is brilliant example. These are brilliant examples to show us that in the Turkish case, unlike Christianity, unlike West, Islam still has some arguments about nature, about science, about causality. The question is important, and more important is how is this question answered in Turkish Islam? Which physical laws should be considered in these areas? Another example, for instance, this is a 10th grade textbook. What do you understand by of no nature? It's important. So how the question is answered? Shall we believe in that? Is there an exist or doesn't exist? And there are long sections in these compulsory religious classes, which students should participate 8 consecutive years, discussions on nature. Okay. So my results, after analyzing the whole relevant literature, this is the Turkish idea of nature as taught to Turkish people in mosque, in classroom, neighborhood. First, there is a highly skeptical stance on causality and belief in divine causation determining natural events. Second, there is a deep suspicion about capacity of human reasoning and sensation, and there is a consequent belief in the existence and necessity of inner knowledge. Third, there is a limited recognition of human autonomy over this. And there is a highly personal conception of God. Turkish God is a God of daily life. It's in daily life, it decides the football team, it decides the economy, it decides about everything. So this is mainly Ash'ari view. And some other points about that. For example, Ghazali is the case scholar. And you never even see reference to Maturidi on these issues. As a very interesting example, after analyzing 8 years all relevant textbooks, there is only one reference to Ibn Rushd, only one. And it's very useless. It just appears under a portrait done by Italian painters. So we don't know why he's quoted. So imagine you are teaching kids 8 years about nature and causality, but you never talk about Ibn Rushd. You are only focusing on Ghazali. So if I am asked to comment how I describe Turkish idea of nature, if I put Ash'ari's Kitabul Luma and Maturidi's Kitabul Tawhid, I will definitely say that Turks are close to Ash'ari, very much close to Ash'ari. Okay, so this is the conclusion, the table I did. Okay, this is the idea of Islamic nature as taught in contemporary Turkey. As you see at the top, it's God's agency. So God is the agent in the universe, decide everything, and Islamic rules as revealed, Sharia is the second. So we should, which requires we should test what we know according to that. And inner knowledge, as you see in this table or in this chart, natural law and rational knowledge is existing, but at the lowest level. Let me clarify a point about this. I should say that finally, how is this possible? Mainly because of one point. As I observe in the Turkish case, this idea of nature we detect in Turkey is a typical paradigm produced in Middle Ages. So interestingly, scholars, religious actors in Turkey, why they are articulating of idea of nature, they keep quoting Ghazali, medieval guys. They don't quote, for example, Feynman. They don't quote, for example, Hubble. Or so the reason of this continuity is, even in 20th century, while speculating on idea of Islamic idea of nature, religious actors in Turkey refer mainly to the cosmological ideas of medieval ages Muslim scholars, but they were living in medieval ages. So this is the main reason why we observe continuity. Okay, so maybe I have suggestions, but we can go on later. I don't want to, go beyond the time. So I stop here. So briefly, studying the Turkish case, I observed that even Turkey is known as a Maturidi. We have this Ash'ari perspective, which is very skeptical of causality, which is very skeptical of free will, and give huge credit to inner science. So this is mainly an updated, pre-modern, medieval, and pre-scientific mentality that Turkish people learn part of their religious socialization. Okay, let me stop here, Faiz. Then we may go through your discussions. Okay.
Thank you, Gokhan. That was a very interesting and philosophical discussion, I must